The brass sheriff's star felt cold against his palm, which was strange because the metal had been sitting against his chest all day, warmed by his own skin. Sheriff Elias Finch stood frozen on the boardwalk outside the mercantile, his fingers wrapped around the star he'd just unpinned without thinking. 20 yards away, a cloud of dust still hung in the air over Main Street, and 3 men lay motionless in the dirt. Elias hadn't fired a single shot. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the stranger holster his pistol. The man moved slow and easy, like he'd just finished morning chores instead of ending 3 lives in less than 10 seconds. A scar split his right eyebrow clean in two, and his clothes were all black: black hat, black vest, black boots dusty from the trail. He stood alone in the street while the whole town watched from behind windows and doorways. Just 15 minutes earlier, Elias had been inside the mercantile, arguing with Martha Higgins about the price of coffee beans. She wanted 50 cents a pound. He told her that was robbery. She told him he didn't know the first thing about running a business. Normal stuff. Tuesday morning stuff. Then the thunder of hooves came down the street, and by the time Elias pushed through the door with his hand on his gun, it was already over. The 3 men on the ground wore the same gray bandanas. Silas Cade's men. Everyone knew those bandanas. They'd been terrorizing settlements for 50 miles in every direction, burning farms that couldn't pay protection, scaring off families who tried to build something new. Elias had been tracking them for weeks, always arriving a day too late, always finding ashes and empty homes. Today they'd come for the bank. Today they'd found someone else first. Elias walked toward the stranger, his boots loud on the wooden boards then muffled by the dust of the street. His deputy, a kid named Tom who wasn't quite 19, stood nearby with his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. Tom's hand still rested on his holster, but his gun hadn't cleared leather either. "You all right, deputy?" Elias asked without looking at him. Tom swallowed hard. "I didn't even see him draw, Sheriff." 1 second they was yelling about burning the bank. Next second they was on the ground. The stranger stood with his back to them, reloading his pistol with practiced ease. His fingers moved quick but steady, sliding fresh rounds into the chambers. Elias noticed the man's horse tied to the rail outside the saloon, a rangy sorrel with a white blaze, saddle worn but well-oiled. "Trail horse. Traveling man. Mister," Elias called out. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "You want to turn around slow and tell me what happened here?" The stranger finished reloading before he moved. He holstered his pistol, adjusted his hat, and only then turned to face them. Up close, Elias could see the man was younger than he'd expected. Maybe 30. The scar gave him a hard look, but his eyes were calm, almost tired. "They were going to kill the girl," the stranger said. His voice was low, rough at the edges. "Blacksmith's daughter. Can't be more than 14. They wanted the bank manager to open the safe, and when he couldn't fast enough, they grabbed her to make a point." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked toward the blacksmith shop and saw Cyrus Wagner standing in the doorway, one arm wrapped tight around his daughter Rachel. The girl's face was buried in her father's chest, her shoulders shaking. Cyrus met Elias's eyes and gave a single nod. A thank you. A confirmation. Except Elias hadn't done anything. The stranger had. "What's your name?" Elias asked. The man hesitated. Just a flicker, but Elias caught it. "Caleb Cross." The name meant nothing to Elias, which meant nothing either. Names could be borrowed, stolen, invented on the spot. He'd learned that lesson years ago, back when he first pinned on this star and thought the job would be simple. "Well, Mr. Cross," Elias said, "you just saved my town. Or at least saved it from burning down around our ears." Caleb shrugged one shoulder. They picked the wrong day to ride in. From somewhere down the street, a woman started crying. Not sad crying, relieved crying. The kind that comes after the danger passes and the body remembers it was scared. Elias recognized the sound. He'd heard it after fires, after floods, after the worst moments passed, and people realized they'd survived. "You're hurt," Elias said suddenly, noticing for the first time the way Caleb held his left arm slightly away from his body. Caleb glanced down at his side like he'd forgotten. A dark stain was spreading just above his belt, soaking through the black fabric. Not dramatic, not gushing, but there, real and growing. Grazed me, Caleb said. Nothing serious. Elias looked at the stain, then at the bodies in the street, then at the town clock mounted above the feed store. The clock had been broken for a month now, hands frozen at 3:17 ever since a windstorm knocked something loose inside. Nobody had climbed up to fix it yet. Always tomorrow, always later, always when there's time. The clock couldn't tell anyone what time it was, but Elias knew anyway. It was 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in October, 1882, in the town of Red Hill, population 213. And Sheriff Elias Finch had just watched a stranger do his job for him. "Come with me," Elias said. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "To jail?" "To my office. So I can ask you some questions without the whole town listening." Elias pinned his star back on his chest. It still felt cold. "And so my wife doesn't kill me for letting a wounded man bleed on Main Street while I stand around asking questions." Tom stepped forward, uncertainty on his young face. "Sheriff, what about?" He gestured at the bodies. "Get Doc Harris to look at them, then find the undertaker. Take statements from anyone who saw what happened. I'll be in my office." Elias started walking toward the sheriff's office, a small building wedged between the assayers and the telegraph station. After a few steps, he heard boots behind him. Caleb was following. They crossed the street together, passing the chipped blue door of the bank. The paint was peeling in long strips, revealing weathered wood underneath. Through the window, Elias could see the bank manager, Mr. Pritchard, slumped in a chair with his head in his hands. A woman stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder. Alive. Scared, but alive. Elias opened the door to his office and gestured Caleb inside. The room was small but tidy. A desk with papers neatly stacked, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a gun rack on the wall with 3 rifles. The cell in back stood empty, door open. Caleb stepped inside and turned to face him. The morning light through the window caught his face, and Elias noticed for the first time how young he really was. The scar made him look dangerous, but the tired eyes made him look human. "Close the door, would you?" Elias said. Caleb reached back and pushed it shut. The click of the latch seemed louder than it should have been. Outside, Tom's voice called out for Doc Harris, and someone else was yelling about horses, and the town of Red Hill was coming back to life after nearly dying. Inside the sheriff's office, everything went quiet. Elias looked at the man who'd saved his town, the man with no name he could trust, the man bleeding on his floorboards. "All right," Elias said. "Let's talk. Sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you expect. Sometimes they ride in from nowhere with a scarred face and a tired look, and they do what you couldn't do. And then they stand in your office bleeding while the town clock stays frozen at 3:17, waiting for someone to finally climb up and fix it." The door clicked shut, and for a moment neither man moved. Sheriff Elias Finch stood with his back against the wood, watching the stranger who called himself Caleb Cross. The morning light slanted through the dusty window, catching the sweat on Caleb's forehead that hadn't been there a minute ago. Caleb didn't sit down. He moved to the wall instead, leaning his shoulders against it like he needed something solid behind him. His left hand pressed against his side, just above the belt, and when he pulled it away, his palm came back red. "You're bleeding more than you let on," Elias said. Caleb looked at his hand like it belonged to someone else. "It'll stop." Elias had seen enough wounded men to know when blood needed to stop sooner rather than later. He crossed to the cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and a stack of clean rags he kept for cleaning his rifles. The whiskey was good stuff, not the rot gut they served at the saloon. His wife Margaret insisted on keeping decent whiskey in the house, and Elias had learned long ago that keeping Margaret happy meant keeping her whiskey close. "Take off your vest," Elias said. Caleb didn't argue. He unbuttoned his vest with slow, careful movements, then pulled his shirt free from his pants. When he lifted the fabric, Elias could see the wound clearly, A furrow cut across the skin just above his hip bone, maybe 4 inches long. Not deep enough to be deadly, but deep enough to need closing. The bleeding had slowed to a steady ooze, but it wouldn't stay that way if Caleb kept moving around. "This is going to sting," Elias said, uncorking the whiskey. Caleb's jaw tightened. Figured it would. Elias poured the whiskey directly onto the wound. Caleb made a sound low in his throat, something between a grunt and a hiss, but he didn't move. His fingers dug into the wall behind him, knuckles going white, but he stayed standing there with his eyes fixed on the ceiling like he was counting the cracks in the plaster. The smell of whiskey filled the small room, sharp and strong, mixing with the copper smell of blood that Elias had noticed the moment they walked in. He pressed a clean rag against the wound, feeling the warmth of Caleb's skin through the fabric, feeling the way the other man's muscles tensed under his touch. "You've done this before," Caleb said. His voice was tight. "Been sheriff here 12 years. You learn a few things." Elias held the rag steady, applying pressure the way Doc Harris had shown him back when he first pinned on the star. "Margaret says I should have been a doctor. I tell her doctors have to deliver babies, and I'd rather face a dozen armed men than one woman in labor." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched, but the pain pulled it back down. Outside, Elias could hear the town coming back to life. Footsteps on the boardwalk, voices calling back and forth, the creak of wagon wheels. Tom was out there somewhere, doing his best to handle things. Good kid, Tom. Green as spring grass, but his heart was in the right place. "How old are you?" Elias asked. 29. "That scar on your face. How'd you get it?" Caleb's eyes met his for a moment, then looked away. "Knife fight. 5 years back. I lost." Elias nodded like that made sense. He lifted the rag to check the bleeding. Still seeping, but slower now. He poured more whiskey, pressed the rag back down. This time Caleb made no sound at all, just breathed slow and deep through his nose. The clock on Elias's desk ticked away the seconds. That clock worked fine, unlike the one on the feed store. Elias had wound it himself that morning, before any of this started, back when his biggest concern was whether Martha Higgins would come down on her coffee price. "What were you doing in Red Hill?" Elias asked. "Passing through." "Where from?" "East." "Where to?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Didn't decide yet." Elias changed the rag, pressing a fresh one against the wound. The bleeding was definitely slowing now. Good. That was good. He didn't want to have to explain to anyone why a stranger had bled out on his office floor. "Those men out there," Elias said. "Silas Cade's men. You know who Cade is." "I've heard the name." "Then you know they don't forget. They don't forgive. 3 of them just died in my street, and the ones who did it is sitting in my office getting patched up." Elias met Caleb's eyes again. "Cade will come looking." Caleb nodded slowly. "Figured he might. And nothing. I'll be gone by then." The words landed between them like stones. Elias kept pressing on the wound, feeling the warmth of Caleb's blood through the rag, feeling the rhythm of his breathing. This man had saved Rachel Wagner's life, had saved the bank, had saved the whole town from burning. And now he was going to ride away like none of it happened. "Why?" Elias asked. "Why what? Why'd you stop them? You don't know anyone here. You were just passing through. Most men would have kept riding." Caleb looked at the window, at the slice of sky visible through the dusty glass. The girl was screaming. She sounded like my little sister. From back before. He stopped, swallowed. "My little sister died when I wasn't there to help her. Different circumstances. Different place. But I wasn't there." Elias didn't know what to say to that. Sometimes there weren't words for the things people carried. He checked the wound one more time. The bleeding had nearly stopped. He reached for a clean rag and started wrapping it around Caleb's waist, pulling it tight to hold pressure in place. "You'll need to keep this clean," Elias said. "Change the bandage twice a day. If it turns red or starts smelling bad, find a doctor. You sound like you've done this before." "Told you. 12 years as sheriff." Elias tied off the bandage and stepped back. "You want some coffee?" Caleb pulled his shirt down, wincing as the fabric touched the fresh bandage. Coffee would be good. Elias moved to the pot-bellied stove where a pot sat warming. He poured 2 cups, handed one to Caleb. Their fingers didn't touch during the exchange, but they came close. The coffee was hot and bitter. Elias drank it black because that was the only way he knew how. Caleb drank his the same way. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. "For what?" "For not asking more questions. For patching me up. For not throwing me in that cell." Caleb nodded toward the empty cell and back. "You could have. Dead or alive. That's what most sheriffs would see." Elias took another drink of coffee. "Maybe most sheriffs haven't watched a stranger do their job for them. You did fine. You were coming out when it started. I was coming out when it ended." Elias set his cup down. "There's a difference." The clock ticked on. Outside, Tom's voice got louder, then faded again. Someone was organizing a crew to move the bodies. Someone else was sweeping the street. Life went on. Caleb finished his coffee and set the cup on the corner of Elias's desk. "I should go. Find a place to hole up until dark, then move on. You're welcome to stay here until you're steady." Caleb shook his head. "Better if I'm not seen coming out of the sheriff's office." People talk. Elias couldn't argue with that. People did talk. In a town this size, everything got noticed, everything got remembered, everything got repeated until the truth was worn thin as old cloth. Caleb moved toward the door, then stopped. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges. He handed it to Elias. Elias unfolded it and felt his stomach drop. It was a wanted poster. Wanted for robbery, it said. Wanted for assault. Wanted for resisting arrest. And staring back from the crude drawing was the face of the man standing in front of him. Caleb Cross. Reward, $2,000. Dead or alive. "Figured you should know," Caleb said quietly, "before you decided whether to shake my hand or shoot me in the back." Elias stared at the poster. $2,000. That was more money than he made in a year. More than the town's entire budget for law enforcement. Enough to hire deputies, buy new rifles, finally fix that broken clock on the feed store. "The train robbery in Sweetwater last spring," Elias said slowly. "That was you." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Elias looked at the poster, then at the man. The scarred face, the tired eyes, the fresh bandage wrapped around his side. The man who'd saved Rachel Wagner. The man who'd killed 3 of Cade's gang without hesitation. The man who was worth $2,000 dead or alive. "The girl," Elias said. "Rachel. You saved her because she sounded like your sister." Caleb nodded once. Elias folded the poster carefully and held it out. Caleb took it back, tucking it into his coat. "I'll be gone by nightfall," Caleb said. "You won't see me again." He opened the door and stepped out into the morning light. Elias watched him go, watched him walk down the boardwalk past the chipped blue door of the bank, past the people who didn't know they owed him anything, past the clock frozen at 3:17 that nobody had bothered to fix. Sometimes the people who save you are carrying secrets you can't imagine. Sometimes they're worth more dead than alive, and the only thing standing between them and a noose is a sheriff who just watched them bleed and decided some debts can't be paid with paper. The afternoon sun had shifted across the floor of the sheriff's office 3 times since Caleb Cross walked out the door. Elias Finch had watched it move, inch by slow inch, while he sat at his desk pretending to do paperwork. The forms in front of him hadn't changed in hours. The words blurred together every time he tried to read them. $2,000. The number kept circling back through his mind no matter how hard he tried to push it away. $2,000 would fix the roof on the church. $2,000 would buy new boots for every kid in town whose toes were poking through. $2,000 would hire 2 full-time deputies so Elias could sleep through the night for the first time in years. $2,000 for one man's life. Elias pushed back from his desk and stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. He needed air. He needed to move. He needed to stop thinking about wanted posters and bleeding strangers and the way Caleb had looked at him before walking out that door. Main Street was quiet when he stepped outside. The bodies were gone, hauled off to the undertaker's shed behind the church. The street had been swept clean of dust and blood, though if you looked close you could still see dark stains soaking into the wooden boards near where the men had fallen. Someone had tied ribbons on the hitching posts outside the bank. Yellow ribbons, fluttering in the October breeze like tiny flags of thanks. Tom was leaning against the rail outside the mercantile, talking to Rachel Wagner. The blacksmith's daughter looked different now than she had this morning. Her face was still pale, but she was standing straight, and she even managed a small smile when she saw Elias coming. Tom straightened up quick, like a kid caught stealing cookies. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Tom called out. "Rachel was just telling me about her father's new foal. Born last night. A filly. Congratulations," Elias said to Rachel. "That's good news." Rachel nodded. "Father says she's got strong legs. She'll be a good horse someday." She paused, her smile fading just a little. "Sheriff, I never got to thank the man who, this morning, the one who stopped them. Do you know where he went? I wanted to tell him I'm grateful." Elias felt something twist in his chest. He had to move on. "Passing through, that's all." Rachel's face fell, but she nodded like she understood. "Well, if you see him again, tell him thank you. Tell him I'll name the filly after him if he wants." "What was his name?" "Caleb," Elias said. "Caleb Cross." "Caleb," Rachel repeated, testing the sound of it. "That's a good name. Strong." She touched Elias's arm lightly. "You did good today too, Sheriff. Everyone's saying so." Elias managed a nod. He watched Rachel walk back toward the blacksmith shop, her steps lighter than they'd been this morning. Tom watched her go too, a soft look on his young face that Elias recognized all too well. "She's something special," Tom said quietly. "She's 14, Tom." "I know. I'm not. I just mean she's brave. After what happened, most girls would be hiding under their beds. She's out here talking about horses and wanting to thank the man who saved her." Tom shook his head. "I hope I'm that brave someday." Elias clapped him on the shoulder. "You did fine today, Deputy. You kept your head when it counted." Tom beamed at the praise, and Elias felt like a fraud for giving it. He hadn't done anything. Tom hadn't done anything. Caleb Cross had done everything, and now Caleb Cross was out there somewhere with a bullet wound and a wanted poster and $2,000 on his head. "Go check on the livery before you head home," Elias told Tom. "Make sure they've got extra hay in case we get that cold snap the farmers are predicting." Tom nodded and hurried off, glad to have something useful to do. Elias watched him go, then turned and walked the other direction, past the bank with its yellow ribbons, past the feed store with its frozen clock, past the church where someone was practicing hymns on the piano. He ended up at the edge of town without meaning to. The road stretched west toward the mountains, empty and brown and dotted with sagebrush. Caleb had gone that way. Or maybe he'd gone east. Or north. Or south. Elias had no idea, and that was the point. Caleb had said he'd be gone by nightfall, and Elias believed him. But $2,000. Elias turned away from the road and walked back through town. Dusk was settling in, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lanterns flickered to life in windows. The smell of supper drifted from open doors, roasting meat, baking bread, the ordinary smells of ordinary life. At his own door, Elias paused. Light glowed through the window, and he could hear Margaret moving around inside, humming some tune he didn't recognize. He thought about walking in, sitting down at the table, eating supper like nothing had happened, like he hadn't spent the whole afternoon staring at wanted posters in his mind. He walked in anyway. Margaret looked up from the stove and smiled. "There you are. I was starting to think you'd moved into that office of yours." She gestured at the table, already set with 2 plates. "Wash up. Supper's ready." Elias washed his hands in the basin by the door, watching the water turn gray with the day's dust. He dried them on the towel and sat down across from his wife of 19 years. She'd been pretty when they married, and she was still pretty now, even with gray threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes from too many summers in the sun. "You look tired," Margaret said, spooning potatoes onto his plate. "Long day." "I heard." She sat down across from him. "The whole town heard. Martha Higgins came by this afternoon. Said you were a hero." Elias almost laughed. Martha Higgins said that. She said you kept your head while everyone else panicked. She said if you hadn't been there, things might have gone different. Margaret tilted her head, studying him. You don't look like a man who just saved his town. Elias looked down at his plate. The potatoes were golden brown, the way he liked them. Margaret always remembered. I didn't save anyone. The stranger did. The one who rode in this morning. The one who killed those men. The same. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Martha said he rode out this afternoon. Said she saw him heading west. Elias nodded, not trusting his voice. You want to tell me what's really bothering you? Margaret asked softly. Because I've known you 19 years, Elias Finch, and I know when you're carrying something heavy. Elias set down his fork. The words wanted to come out, wanted to spill across the table like the potatoes on his plate. $2,000. Wanted poster. Dead or alive. But if he told Margaret, she'd be part of it. She'd carry it too, and she didn't deserve that. He saved Rachel Wagner's life, Elias said finally. Threw himself in front of her without thinking twice. Took a bullet for a girl he'd never met. Margaret nodded slowly. That's the kind of man you wish you'd met under different circumstances. Yeah. Elias picked up his fork again. That's exactly it. They ate in silence for a while. The food was good, but Elias barely tasted it. His mind kept drifting back to that moment in the office. Caleb pressing the rag against his own wound. Caleb handing over the wanted poster like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. I'm going to check on things at the office after supper, Elias said. Make sure everything's locked up. Margaret gave him a look that said she didn't quite believe him, but she didn't argue. Don't be late. The office was dark when Elias let himself in. He lit the lamp on his desk and sat down in his chair, letting the quiet settle around him. The cell in back stood empty, door open. The stack of papers on his desk hadn't moved. The clock ticked on, steady and relentless. $2,000. Elias pulled open his desk drawer and rummaged through it until he found what he was looking for. An old wanted poster, months old, for a horse thief they'd caught over near Pine Creek. He spread it on the desk and stared at it, at the rough drawing of a man's face, at the numbers at the bottom. $300. That was more typical. Horse thieves, bank robbers, men who'd killed people. They usually went for a few hundred, maybe 1,000 if the crime was bad enough. 2,000 was different. 2,000 meant something. 2,000 meant the law wanted this man bad. Wanted him so bad they were willing to pay a year's wages to anyone who brought him in. Elias thought about Caleb's hands, steady and sure as they reloaded his pistol. He thought about Caleb's voice, low and rough, saying the girl sounded like his sister. He thought about the way Caleb had handed over that poster like he was handing over a piece of himself. The lamp flickered. Elias looked up and caught his reflection in the dark window glass. An old man stared back at him. 52 years old, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes. A sheriff who'd spent 12 years keeping the peace in a town that almost burned today while he argued about coffee prices. Who was he to judge anyone? Elias folded the horse thief poster and put it back in the drawer. He sat for a long time, listening to the clock tick, watching his reflection in the glass. Somewhere out there, Caleb Cross was riding through the dark with a bullet wound and a price on his head. Somewhere out there, Silas Cade was probably already planning his revenge. And here in Red Hill, the clock on the feed store was still frozen at 3:17, waiting for someone to finally climb up and fix it. Elias made up his mind. He'd let Caleb go. He'd forget about the wanted poster, forget about the $2,000, forget about everything except what he'd seen with his own eyes. A man bleeding for a girl he didn't know. Tomorrow he'd climb up and fix that clock. Today he'd just sit here in the quiet and let himself believe he'd made the right choice. The clock ticked on. The lamp burned low. And somewhere in the darkness, a man named Caleb Cross was riding away from the only people who'd ever called him a hero. Elias hoped he made it. He hoped the wound healed clean and the memories faded and the wanted poster ended up at the bottom of some river where nobody would ever find it. He hoped that somewhere, years from now, Caleb Cross would sit down to supper with someone who loved him and tell them about the time He saved a town and rode away before anyone could thank him properly. But hope wasn't the same as belief. And as Elias sat alone in his office, watching his reflection in the dark glass, he couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over yet. That somewhere out there, the threads were still tangling, still pulling, still winding toward a moment none of them could see coming. The clock struck 9. Elias blew out the lamp and walked home through the dark, past the yellow ribbons fluttering outside the bank, past the frozen clock, past all the ordinary things that suddenly seemed so fragile. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong. Sometimes it's between what the law says and what your heart knows. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they turn out to be the same thing after all. The silver dollar sat on the pillow where Caleb's head had rested, catching the morning light through the open cell door. Elias picked it up slowly, turning it over in his fingers. It was warm, like it had been held close to someone's skin. On one side, the words, "In God We Trust." On the other, a lady with flowing hair and a date from 1878. He'd taken the money. Not much, just a single dollar from the donation fund Elias kept in his desk drawer for travelers who needed a meal or a place to sleep. But he'd taken it, and he'd left this one behind like some kind of message. Like he was saying, "I'm not a thief. Not really. Not where it counts." Elias closed his fingers around the coin until the edges bit into his palm. The cell was empty. The blankets were folded neat on the cot, the way Margaret always folded blankets at home. Caleb had made the bed before he left. A wanted man, a man with $2,000 on his head, and he'd made the damn bed. Elias walked back to his desk and sat down hard. The coin sat in front of him, small and ordinary and heavy with meaning. He'd been wrong about Caleb, wrong about him staying, wrong about him being different, wrong about everything. The clock ticked. 9 in the morning now. Caleb had maybe 6 hours head start, maybe 7. Enough time to be long gone if he'd ridden hard. Enough time to be dead if Cade's men had found him first. Tom burst through the door without knocking, his young face pale as milk. "Sheriff, you need to come outside." Elias was on his feet before he knew he'd moved. "What is it?" "Riders. Coming fast from the west. At least 20 of them." Tom swallowed hard. "They're wearing gray bandanas." The world went very quiet for just a second. Then Elias was moving, grabbing his hat, checking his pistol, pulling his rifle from the rack on the wall. 20 men. Kate had sent 20 men to avenge the 3 who died yesterday. 20 men for a town with 1 sheriff, 1 green deputy, and maybe a dozen farmers who could shoot straight. "How long?" Elias asked. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Elias strapped on his gun belt and headed for the door. Tom followed close behind, his boots loud on the floorboards. Outside, Main Street was already stirring with panic. People ran for their homes, pulling children inside, slamming doors, shuttering windows. The yellow ribbons outside the bank fluttered in the morning breeze, bright and cheerful and completely wrong. "Get everyone inside," Elias told Tom. "Tell them to stay there, keep their heads down, and not come out no matter what they hear." Tom nodded and ran. Elias stood alone in the middle of the street, watching the western road. Dust rose on the horizon, a brown cloud getting bigger by the second. 20 men, maybe more, coming to burn what they couldn't take. He thought about Margaret, probably already hiding in the root cellar the way they'd practiced after that scare 2 years ago. He thought about Rachel Wagner, just a kid who'd already been through enough. He thought about the frozen clock on the feed store, still stuck at 3:17, still waiting for someone to care enough to climb up and fix it. And he thought about Caleb Cross, riding away with a bullet wound and a wanted poster and a silver dollar he'd left behind like some kind of goodbye. Elias started walking toward the riders. He didn't know what he was going to do. Talk maybe. Stall maybe. Give the town enough time to hide, enough time to pray, enough time for something to change. His boots kicked up dust with every step. The rifle felt heavy in his hands. The pistol felt heavy on his hip. Everything felt heavy, like the whole world was pressing down on his shoulders. The riders came fast. Elias could see them now, 22 by his count, Men with hard faces and gray bandanas and guns in their hands. They slowed when they saw him standing alone in the road, just a single man with a rifle and a star, blocking their path like that meant anything. The lead rider held up his hand, and the whole group stopped maybe 50 yards out. Dust swirled around them, brown and thick. The horses stamped and snorted, restless from the run. "That's far enough," Elias called out. His voice sounded steady. He didn't know how. The lead rider urged his horse forward a few steps. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a beard that needed trimming and eyes that looked like they'd never smiled at anything. "Where's the man who killed my boys?" "Gone." "Gone where?" Elias shook his head. "Doesn't matter. He's not here. This town has nothing to do with what happened yesterday. Those men came here to rob our bank and burn our buildings, and they got what they deserved." "Ride on." The big man laughed. It wasn't a nice sound. "Ride on." He says ride on. He looked back at his men, and they laughed too. 22 men laughing at one sheriff standing alone in the dust. "We're not leaving empty-handed," the big man said. "We came for blood. Your blood, since theirs is already spilled. Give us the man who killed our brothers, or we burn this town to the ground with everyone in it." Elias gripped his rifle tighter. "I told you. He's gone. Then you'll do." The big man reached for his gun, and Elias knew he was about to die. 22 against 1. No chance. No hope. Just dust and blood and a town that would burn anyway once he was gone. Then a voice called out from somewhere to his left. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Elias turned his head so fast his neck cracked. Caleb Cross stepped out from behind a cluster of rocks maybe 30 yards away, his pistol already drawn, his black clothes dusty from a night spent in the open. He looked terrible, pale under the tan, moving careful like his side still hurt, but standing steady and calm with a gun in his hand. The big man stared at him. "You're the one who killed my men." "I'm the one." Caleb walked closer, angling so he stood maybe 20 feet from Elias, forming a kind of line. 2 men against 22. It was still insane. It was still hopeless. But something in Elias's chest loosened just a little. "You were supposed to be gone," Elias said quietly. Caleb glanced at him, and for just a second, something passed between them. Something that looked almost like a smile. "I came back for my dollar." The big man looked from one to the other, confusion on his face. "What dollar? What are you talking about?" Caleb ignored him completely. He kept his eyes on Elias. "Figured I owed you. For the whiskey. For the bandages. For not throwing me in that cell." He nodded toward the riders. "Figured I'd stick around and make sure you didn't do anything stupid, like face 20 men alone." 22, Elias corrected. "Even worse." The big man's face went red with rage. "You think this is funny? You think we're playing games?" He pulled his gun and aimed it at Caleb. "You're dead, stranger. You're both dead. And then we're burning this town so slow the screams will carry all the way to the next county." Elias raised his rifle. Caleb raised his pistol. 22 men raised theirs. The morning sun beat down on Main Street, on the yellow ribbons, on the frozen clock, on 2 men standing back to back against impossible odds. And then Caleb spoke again, his voice low and calm and meant only for Elias. "Remember that knife fight I told you about? The one I lost?" Elias nodded, not taking his eyes off the riders. "Well, I learned something from losing. I learned that sometimes the only way to win is to do something the other side ain't expecting." Caleb's voice stayed calm, almost conversational. "These boys are expecting us to shoot it out. They're expecting us to die brave and stupid. What are you planning?" Caleb didn't answer with words. He holstered his pistol, slow and deliberate, and held up both hands empty. Then he started walking toward the riders. Elias stared. "What are you doing?" "Trust me," Caleb said over his shoulder. "And when I give the word, hit the ground." The riders watched Caleb approach, confusion on their faces. The big man kept his gun raised, but he didn't fire. Nobody fired. They all just watched this crazy man walking toward them with empty hands and a bullet wound and a look on his face that said he knew something they didn't. Caleb stopped maybe 10 feet from the lead horse. "You want me," he called out. "Here I am. Take me. Collect your reward. Let the town go." The big man narrowed his eyes. "You think we're stupid? You think we'll just ride off with you and forget about the town? I think you came for blood, and here I am. The one who actually killed your men. The sheriff over there didn't fire a shot yesterday. Neither did anyone else in town. It was just me." Caleb spread his arms wider. "So take me. Hang me. Do whatever you want. But leave these people alone. They got nothing to do with it." Elias wanted to shout, wanted to run forward, wanted to do something. But Caleb had said trust him, and for some reason Elias did. He stood frozen, rifle half raised, watching the impossible scene unfold. The big man thought about it. Elias could see him thinking, weighing options, figuring angles. Take the killer, send a message, save ammunition. It made sense. It was the smart play. "Tie him up," the big man ordered. 2 riders dismounted and moved toward Caleb. They grabbed his arms, rough and quick, and started binding his wrists with rope. Caleb didn't resist. He stood there like he had all the time in the world, letting them tie him, letting them think they'd won. And then, just as they finished the last knot, Caleb looked back at Elias and said 2 words. "Now, Sheriff." Elias hit the ground without thinking, his face in the dust, his hands over his head. And the world exploded. Later, Elias would piece together what happened. The dynamite Caleb must have planted during the night, hidden in the rocks where he'd been waiting. The fuse he'd lit just before walking out with his hands up. The explosion that sent rocks and dust and terror through the riders, scattering horses, sending men diving for cover, turning order into chaos. Elias lifted his head from the dust and saw Caleb moving. His hands were still tied, but his legs were free, and he was running toward the rocks, toward cover, toward the rifle Elias now saw leaning against a boulder where Caleb must have left it. "Cover me," Caleb shouted. Elias raised his rifle and started firing. Not to hit, just to keep heads down, just to buy time. Tom appeared from somewhere, his own gun blazing. Windows opened along Main Street, and more guns joined in. Farmers, shopkeepers, men who'd never fired at another human being in their lives. The riders panicked. Horses reared and bolted. Men shouted and fired wild. The big man screamed orders nobody could hear over the chaos. And Caleb reached the rocks, grabbed his rifle, and started firing with that same calm precision Elias had seen yesterday. One rider fell, then another, then a third. "Fall back," someone shouted. "Fall back, it's a trap." The riders broke. 22 men turned and rode, leaving their dead and wounded behind, leaving the town they'd come to destroy. Elias kept firing until they were out of range, until the dust settled, until the only sounds were his own ragged breathing and the ringing in his ears. Caleb walked out of the rocks, his hands free now. He must have worked the ropes loose during the chaos. He looked even worse than before, pale and sweating, one hand pressed against his side where the bandage showed dark with fresh blood. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen," Elias said. His voice shook. His whole body shook. Caleb almost smiled. "Worked, didn't it? You could have died. Could have. Didn't." Caleb swayed on his feet, and Elias grabbed his arm to steady him. "Told you I came back for my dollar." Tom ran up, his young face wild with excitement. "They're gone. They're really gone. Sheriff, we did it. We actually did it." Elias looked at Tom, at the townspeople emerging from their homes, at the riders disappearing into the distance. Then he looked at Caleb, bleeding and pale and barely standing. "Get Doc Harris," Elias told Tom. "Now." Tom ran. Elias guided Caleb toward the office, half carrying him, feeling the other man's weight against his shoulder. Caleb's boots dragged in the dust, leaving 2 lines behind them like strange trails leading nowhere. "You came back," Elias said quietly. "Told you. My dollar." "Stop saying that." Caleb's laugh turned into a cough. "Make me." They reached the office and Elias kicked the door open, lowering Caleb into the chair behind his desk. Blood soaked through the bandage, through his shirt, through everything. Elias grabbed fresh rags, more whiskey, anything he could find. "Hold still," he ordered. Caleb leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed. "Sheriff." "What?" "I'm glad I came back." Elias pressed a rag against the wound and watched Caleb's face go white with pain. "Me too," he said. "Me too." Outside, the town of Red Hill was celebrating. Inside, two men sat in a small office, bound together by blood and whiskey and a silver dollar that meant more than money ever could. And somewhere in the distance, the riders kept riding, carrying a story they'd tell for years about the day they rode into a trap set by a ghost. Sometimes the people who leave are the ones who come back. Sometimes the ones you trust with your life are the ones the law wants dead. And sometimes, on an October morning with the sun rising over a town that almost burned, you find out that the man you let go was the only one who ever stayed. 2 days later, the town clock still read 3:17. Elias Finch stood on Main Street and looked up at it, the morning sun warm on his face, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. The clock hadn't moved in weeks. Nobody had climbed up to fix it yet. Always tomorrow, always later, always when there's time. But something felt different about it now. The frozen hands didn't look like a failure anymore. They looked like a promise. Like time was waiting for something, holding its breath until the right moment arrived. The street was quiet this morning. Peaceful. The way Main Street used to feel before everything happened. Yellow ribbons still fluttered outside the bank, a little frayed now, a little faded, but still there. Someone had swept the boardwalks clean. Someone had watered the horses at the trough. Ordinary life, going on like ordinary life does. Elias walked toward the blacksmith shop, nodding to the people he passed. Martha Higgins waved from the mercantile door and actually smiled at him. First time in 12 years. Cyrus Wagner stood outside his shop, hammer in hand, and raised it in greeting like a salute. "Sheriff," Cyrus called out. "Rachel wants to see you when you have a minute." "She okay?" "Better than okay. She's out back with the foal." Cyrus's face softened in that way fathers' faces do when they talk about their children. "That girl's got more spirit than anyone gave her credit for." Elias smiled and kept walking. Around back of the blacksmith shop, in a small corral built against the hillside, Rachel Wagner stood beside a wobbly-legged foal. The little thing was all legs and curiosity, dark brown with a white blaze down its nose. Rachel looked up when Elias approached, and her whole face lit up. "Sheriff, come see." She patted the foal's neck gentle. "Isn't she beautiful?" Elias leaned on the fence and watched the foal take a few unsteady steps. "She sure is. Your father said she was born strong. Strongest foal we've ever had. Doc Harris says she's got good lungs and a good heart. Says she'll make some lucky person a fine horse someday." Rachel looked at Elias with those young eyes that had seen too much too soon. "I'm naming her Caleb." The name hit Elias like a punch to the chest. He kept his face calm, though, the way he'd learned to do over 12 years of being sheriff. "That's a fine name." "I know he's gone," Rachel said quietly. "I know I probably won't ever see him again. But I wanted to remember him. The man who saved me." She looked down at her hands on the fence rail. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if he hadn't been there. If he'd just kept riding like everyone else does." Elias reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "He was a good man. Worth remembering." Rachel nodded, then brightened. "You want to help me feed her? Just some hay. She's not big enough for grain yet." Elias spent the next hour in the corral with Rachel and the foal, feeding hay and watching the little creature discover the world. It was the best hour he'd spent in weeks. Maybe months. Maybe years. By mid-morning, he was back on Main Street, walking past the feed store with its frozen clock, past the mercantile where Martha Higgins now waved every time she saw him, past the bank with its faded yellow ribbons. He ended up at the edge of town without meaning to, the same spot where he'd stood 2 days ago watching riders disappear into the dust. Today the road was empty, just dirt and sagebrush and the mountains in the distance. Elias stood there for a long time, coffee long gone cold in his cup, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. Boots crunched on gravel behind him. Elias turned and felt his heart stop. Caleb Cross stood there, not riding away this time, not bleeding on his office floor, just standing there in the morning sun with a clean shirt and a healed look around his eyes and a small bag in his hand. "You're still here," Elias said. Stupid thing to say, but it was all that came out. Caleb almost smiled. "Told you. Came back for my dollar. The dollar's on my desk. You could have just taken it." "Not the point." Caleb walked closer and stood beside Elias, both of them facing the empty road now. The point was coming back. They stood in silence for a minute. 2 minutes. Elias didn't know. Time felt different now, like the frozen clock had infected everything. "Wound healing?" Elias asked. "Doc Harris says I'll live. Says I got lucky." Caleb touched his side through the shirt. "Doesn't feel lucky yet, but he's the doctor. Margaret wants you to come for supper tonight. She's making pot roast. Says any man who saves her town twice deserves a good meal." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I can't stay, Sheriff. You know that." "I know. Poster's still out. Still worth $2,000 dead or alive. Every lawman in the territory is looking for me." "I know. Then why are you inviting me to supper?" Elias thought about it. Thought about Rachel and the foal named Caleb. Thought about Martha Higgins smiling. Thought about Margaret, who'd held him the night after the shooting and told him he'd done right, that she was proud of him, that some things mattered more than wanted posters and reward money. "Because you're not dead," Elias said finally, "and you're not alive on paper. But you're alive right here, standing next to me, and my wife makes the best pot roast in 3 counties. Seems a shame to miss it." Caleb stared at the road for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "One supper. Then I ride. One supper." They walked back into town together, side by side. Past the feed store with its frozen clock. Past the mercantile where Martha Higgins waved and didn't even seem surprised to see the stranger walking with their sheriff. Past the bank with its yellow ribbons. Past all the ordinary things that suddenly seemed extraordinary. At the edge of Main Street, they passed a wagon loaded with lumber. The driver, a farmer Elias knew from up north, called out a greeting. Behind him, 2 men sat on the wagon seat. Ordinary men with ordinary faces, probably heading to town for supplies. Caleb's hand moved toward his gun. Just a twitch, just instinct. Then he saw the farmer's face, saw the friendly wave, saw the way the men tipped their hats like nothing was wrong. He let his hand drop. "Getting jumpy," he muttered. "Getting smart," Elias corrected. They walked on. At the sheriff's office, Elias stopped. "I need to check on something. You head on to my place. White house with the blue shutters, 2 streets over. Margaret will put you to work if you get there early. Fair warning." Caleb nodded and kept walking. Elias watched him go, watched him pass the feed store, watched him disappear around the corner toward the house with the blue shutters. Then Elias turned and climbed the ladder beside the feed store. It wasn't a hard climb, just rickety old wood that creaked under his weight. He went slow, testing each step, holding tight to the sides. The ladder hadn't been used in months, maybe longer. Dust and bird droppings covered every rung. At the top, Elias pulled himself onto the small platform and looked at the clock face up close. The glass was dirty, the hands frozen solid, the numbers faded by years of sun and wind. He pulled out his pocket knife and pried open the small door on the front. Inside, the mechanism was simpler than he'd expected. Gears and springs and levers, all stopped because one small gear had slipped off its track. Elias reached in careful and nudged it back into place. The clock made a sound like waking up. A click, a whir, a deep mechanical groan. Then the hands started moving. Slow at first, then steady. The minute hand crawled past 3:18, past 3:19, past 3:20. Time, moving again. Ordinary time. The kind that marks ordinary days in ordinary towns where ordinary people live ordinary lives. Elias climbed down slow, feeling the ladder creak under him, feeling the sun warm on his shoulders. At the bottom, he turned and looked up at the clock. 3:24 now. Still morning, but the clock didn't know that. The clock just knew it was time to start moving again. He walked home through streets that felt different now. Lighter somehow. The yellow ribbons fluttered. The clock ticked. Somewhere a dog barked and a child laughed, and a woman called someone in for dinner. At his front door, Elias paused. Through the window, he could see Margaret moving around the kitchen, her familiar shape behind the glass. And there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, was Caleb Cross. Not running, not hiding, just sitting in a regular kitchen in a regular house, waiting for pot roast like a regular person. Elias unpinned his sheriff star and held it in his palm. It was warm from the sun, warm against his skin, warm the way things get when they've been where they belong. He pinned it back on and opened the door. The smell of pot roast hit him first. Margaret's pot roast, the best in 3 counties, with potatoes and carrots and gravy that could make a man forget his own name. She stood at the stove, stirring something, and looked over her shoulder with that smile he'd been falling in love with for 19 years. "Just in time," she said. "Wash up. Food's ready." Caleb looked up from his coffee. There was something different in his eyes now. Not tired, not hunted, just present. Here, in this moment, in this kitchen, in this town that wouldn't exist without him. Elias washed his hands at the basin and sat down across from Caleb. Margaret brought the food to the table and sat down too. For a moment nobody moved. Then Margaret reached out and took Elias's hand, and Elias reached out and took Caleb's hand, and Caleb looked surprised for just a second before he took Margaret's other hand. "Bless this food," Margaret said quietly, "and bless the hands that prepared it. And thank you for bringing us all here, together, safe." "Amen," Elias said. Caleb just nodded. But his eyes said more than words ever could. They ate. They talked. They laughed at stories from Margaret's childhood and Elias's early days as sheriff and Caleb's adventures on the trail, the ones he could tell without incriminating himself. The food was as good as promised. The company was better. Later, after the plates were cleared and the dishes washed, Caleb stood at the door with his bag in his hand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had a long ride ahead. "Thank you," Caleb said. "For everything." Elias nodded. "Be careful out there." "I will." "And Caleb." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver dollar. The one Caleb had left on the pillow. The one he'd come back for. He held it out. Caleb looked at it for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You keep it. Something to remember me by." Elias closed his fingers around the coin. Warm again. Warm from his pocket. Warm from the day. Warm from everything. "Ride safe," Elias said. Caleb nodded and walked out into the fading light. Elias stood on the porch and watched until the dust settled, and the road was empty, and the only sounds were ordinary sounds from an ordinary evening. Margaret came up beside him and slipped her arm through his. "Think we'll ever see him again?" Elias thought about wanted posters and reward money and the long road ahead. He thought about Rachel's foal and Martha Higgins smiling and the clock on the feed store ticking away the minutes. "I don't know," he said, "but I think wherever he ends up, he'll be all right. Some people are just built that way." They stood together on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. The town clock chimed 7, the first time it had chimed in weeks. Down the street, yellow ribbons fluttered in the evening breeze. Somewhere a dog barked and a child laughed, and life went on the way life does. And in his pocket, Elias Finch carried a silver dollar that weighed almost nothing but meant everything. A reminder that sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you expect. Sometimes they ride in from nowhere with a scarred face and a tired look, and they do what you couldn't do, and then they ride away again. But for one night, they sit at your table and eat your wife's pot roast and become part of your story. The clock chimed again. Time moved on. And Red Hill, population 213, went back to being the kind of place where ordinary things happened to ordinary people. But they knew now. Every single one of them knew that ordinary is just a word. That underneath the surface, everything is extraordinary. That a frozen clock can start again. That a wanted man can be a hero. That a sheriff's star feels warm when it's worn by someone who remembers what it means to wear it. Elias Finch stood on his porch with his wife beside him and watched the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow there would be work to do, reports to file, rounds to make. a town to look after. But tonight, just for tonight, he let himself be grateful. Grateful for pot roast and yellow ribbons and a clock that finally told the right time. Grateful for a stranger who came back when he didn't have to. Grateful for a town that survived because one man stopped running long enough to stand still. The stars came out bright and clear. The night air carried the smell of sage and wood smoke and ordinary life. And somewhere out there on a dark road, a man named Caleb Cross rode toward whatever came next, carrying nothing but a healed wound and a full stomach and maybe, just maybe, the memory of a place that called him a hero. Which, when you think about it, is really all any of us can hope for. A place where we're remembered, a story worth telling, a reason to come back, even when coming back makes no sense at all. The clock struck 8. Elias and Margaret went inside, and the town of Red Hill settled into the peaceful dark, protected not by walls or guns, but by the simple truth that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand together. Even if just for one night, even if just for one meal, even if just for the memory of a man who came back for his dollar and ended up leaving something worth far more behind.